Hey, good evening, APUSH Nation. Welcome in here as we do another Fireside chat. And the topic today is going to be on the mounting abolition movement in the antebellum period. And to begin things, I want to get into a couple key examples. We left off today in class talking about some examples of slave insurrections that occurred in the United States, like the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy, which actually was more of Denmark-Vesey being arrested and accused of leading a conspiracy. And then obviously the paramount one is Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 in Virginia. But there's a couple cases that I want to bring to your attention that are important to highlight because these involve ships that were carrying slaves and became right front and center, in the discussion on abolition. And the first case I want to bring up is from a case known as the Amistad cases. The Amistad case deals with a group of slaves that were on a Spanish ship from West Africa to Cuba, as many ships had journeyed on the Middle Passage. Now, the problem with this group of slaves and this ship was it was in 1838, 1839. That was illegal to be transporting slaves in the Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade was deemed illegal by most countries in this time period. Now the slaves on their journey to the New World, which by then was really Spanish Cuba, the slaves on the Middle Passage led an insurrection on the ship. They took over the ship and they killed a number of the crew, the Spanish slave traders' crew. They took the ship over and forced some of the remaining survivors to sail them to what they hoped would be back to Africa. But what happened is the crew tricked the remaining crew, the surviving crew from the attack, the mutiny, tricked the slaves and actually sailed north. And they wound up stopping somewhere in the vicinity of Connecticut and Long Island, New York. The Amistad case, and that was named after the ship. The Amistad case became a lightning rod for international controversy, and it drew nationwide and international attention towards the question of slavery in the United States. Because when the slaves arrived in America, the question was, were they free? Or would they be sent back to Spain, which is where they were, of course, captured from by Spanish slave traders? The Amistad case, and this involved numerous African slaves, or I guess you wouldn't even call them slaves because they were not yet, serving on plantations. But the passengers of the Amistad wound up becoming front and center in the abolition movement, whether they liked it or not, because numerous Americans who were abolitionists took up the cause of promoting the Amistad case as an argument for abolition. Here were a group of slaves, people sold into slavery illegally by the Spanish that wound up in the United States. Now, the Spanish government was demanding that the slaves were returned. But eventually, the legality of the Amistad case went into the courts, and lawsuits were filed, and eventually, whether the question of the freedom for the slaves who were sold illegally went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. This got all the way to the Supreme Court after numerous appeals. Many abolitionists took up the cause of trying to free the Amistad Africans. And when the case came to the Supreme Court, one of the prosecutors, I wouldn't say prosecutors, one of the trial lawyers to argue on behalf of the Amistad slaves was John Quincy Adams, former president, who was 75 years old. Quincy Adams wasn't the only member of the defense of the Amistad crew, but he made a rather compelling argument. And ultimately, the United States Supreme Court declared that the Amistad slaves were free on the grounds that the Spanish had illegally captured the slaves from Africa and tried to bring them to Cuba. The court's ruling, however, is not as resounding a victory in abolition as you may think. The court essentially ruled on the technicality that international law was violated when the slaves were captured in Africa illegally by the Spanish. Therefore, the United States was under no compulsion to pay back or return the slaves to the Spanish. So the slaves get their freedom. Not too many of them stay in the United States. Money was raised. Many of the slaves, while living in Connecticut, were taught English and were converted to Christianity by members of the Yale Divinity School. And eventually money was raised to send some of these Amistad slaves back to Africa. Some did stay in the United States, but very few did. And the Amistad case is, again, it's an important one to be aware of in the movement of abolition because it involves the courts, right? And in most cases, the Supreme Court was not brought in on the question of slavery until, of course, the all-important Dred Scott decision, which we'll be getting to later this week. So chalk the Amistad case up as an important Supreme Court case where slaves were given their freedom in America, but only on the technicality that they were captured illegally. Now, involving another case involving similar circumstances was a slave ship named the Creole. And the Creole case is unique from the Amistad case because the Creole case involved an American slave ship that was moving passengers from Virginia down to New Orleans. There was nothing illegal about this. There was nothing at all illegal about this. And when the Creole ship left Virginia in the 1840s, I forgot the year exactly. I think the year is not the most important thing here. The point is that when the Creole case occurred, there was another mutiny, like the Amistad. There was a mutiny on board, and the slaves took over the ship. They killed very few of the white crew. I think a couple people died. But the slaves were able to actually compel the crew to sail to the Bahamas, which were then controlled by the British and had already abolished slavery. So the slaves on the Creole ship went to the Bahamas, and they were actually granted their freedom. Now, much like the Amistad, there was immense pressure, although the situation was inverse now. There were demands from the United States to return the slaves back to the U.S. However, the British government fully supported its decision to liberate the slaves. And the Creole Uprising is what it's sometimes called, is actually considered to be one of the all-time most successful slave uprisings in history. So the Creole case is an interesting one because it's actually a victory for the slaves. They get to the Bahamas and they're free. I want to give you one more example of a slave insurrection, and that involves a little-known story about the Cherokee Nation uprisings in the 1840s. So after the Cherokee were forced off the land, they set up their new nation in modern-day Oklahoma, thanks to the Indian removal policies of the Jackson and Van Buren administrations. Well, the natives brought with them slaves because slavery was so embedded in the culture of the South, including Native American culture, that the Cherokee had slaves on their own in Cherokee Nation. But groups of African Americans, about 20 or so, led an armed uprising where they fled down into Mexico, and they gained their freedom there. And the Cherokee Nation slave uprisings is, again, it's a unique situation because we don't often hear about how Native American tribes had slaves. But in this case, the Cherokee did condone slavery, and consequently, African Americans were able to escape slavery during the Cherokee slave uprisings, and this occurred throughout the 1840s. And it was widely covered, not so much in the mainstream American press, but to the Cherokee Nation, much like the United States faced the threat of uprisings, the Cherokee did as well. And, when we lump this all together, we think back to what we learned today in class. One of the dire consequences, and this is true of the Cherokee as well, especially with Nat Turner, we talk about how Nat Turner's rebellion systematically made slavery more difficult, tougher, stricter. Same thing happened in the Cherokee uprisings. The Cherokee passed all sorts of laws that would further restrict slave rights. And in the end, these revolts oftentimes backfire. And that's the common theme within these slave insurrections. To pivot here a little bit, with all these insurrections, these are being done by Africans. But I don't want to undermine the efforts of a lot of whites in America during the 1830s, 40s, the Antebellum period, for putting together hard-pressing abolition movements. And, there's three examples of quick ones I want to give you. The first is, think about what we said all along. The main means of fighting against a cause in this antebellum period remains through words. Women's rights movement used words at Seneca Falls. The Great Awakening speakers used their words in their revival meetings. Abolitionists, too, fought with words. And One of the chief abolitionists who gains a lot of notoriety and national attention is William Lloyd Garrison. He was on the reading quiz. His name was mentioned. He was the publisher of an important abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. And this newspaper published all sorts of abolitionist literature, along with key pieces of runaway slave literature, like Frederick Douglass's story, which often he was a key contributor to The Liberator. And The Liberator wrote a lot of abolitionist literature, published it through pamphlets. They were well-financed. And so The Liberator was one of the more reputable abolitionist publications, weekly publications, like a newspaper, that was out there. And William Lloyd Garrison was not only a publisher, but he was also highly active in abolitionist circles around the United States. And one of the most prominent abolitionist groups that were on paper as being like a well-funded, well-organized group was the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, like any national organization, the American Anti-Slavery Society had their agenda pretty well entrenched. They were against slavery. And so they drew a lot of respect and a lot of attention, especially members of the churches. And there was a whole thing in the reading about how, abolition took on a very important religious purpose within Christian communities. And it goes back to, once again, the great effects of the Second Great Awakening. Abolition, although we briefly mentioned it with the Second Great Awakening, was a key cornerstone of the Second Great Awakening's social reforms. And so groups like the American Anti-Slavery Society utilized their Christian values, their Protestant Christian values, to not only evangelize more and more African Americans, but also to take up abolition as a social and religious cause. So be aware that the American Anti-Slavery Society and people like William Lloyd Garrison were heavily infused by their religion. And then that takes us to the third group of people I want to talk about. And these are two women. Their story is rather interesting. They were white Southern women who were born into slavery, meaning that they lived on a plantation in South Carolina. But what made their story unique is that they eventually began to reject the institution of slavery on the fundamental basis that they converted to Quakerism. Quakerism was not very well entrenched in the Deep South. It was more of a northern sect of Protestantism that goes all the way back to William Penn and the founding of Pennsylvania colony. And the two women that I'm going to draw your attention to, their names were Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Grimke with apostrophe. And the Grimke sisters are great proponents in the antebellum period. They wrote prolifically about abolition, and they were rejected by their family. They were ostracized by their family for being Quakers because of the association of Quakerism with abolition, another Second Great Awakening tieback. And the Grimke sisters eventually came north and began writing for groups and abolitionist groups and began publishing works basically denigrating slavery. And their experience was quite unique because unlike people like William Lloyd Garrison, who were Northerners, abolitionists, the Grimke sisters lived in slavery. They saw it firsthand. And they became very popular, very well-known speakers that traveled the country advocating on the behalf of slavery. Advocating on the behalf of the abolition of slavery. The Grimke sisters were also pivotal figures, too, in the women's rights movement. And it reinforces something I've taught you guys since we did that Transcendentalist lesson. Abolition and women's rights went together. They went hand in hand. And that's mainly because a lot of slaves and a lot of abolitionists and women's rights activists felt that their cause was similar in the way that they were downtrodden within society. So I give you three examples. William Lloyd Garrison, who published The Liberator, the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was a Second Great Awakening based religious group that advocated on behalf of abolition. And then we talked about the Grimke sisters very briefly. So three examples, three ID terms to be aware of as abolitionists. Tomorrow the focus is going to be on, though, African Americans. We're going to look at David Walker and his appeal. We're going to talk about the slave narrative that you read, written by Solomon Northup. And then we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad as an important vehicle for African Americans to escape towards Canada and the North. So a lot packed in here, but this is all just basically recapping what's in the reading. Hopefully today's reading quiz went well for you guys, and I'll end this as I always do. The past shapes the future. Have a good night.